Welcome to a 5-minute course on understanding mythology and how to study myths. So, first off, what is a myth? Well, myth is a type of story, and we get various story types. We have myths, we have legends, we have fairy tales, and we have history. And they're the 4 key types. So, history are facts, and they happen in this world that's happened here, and they can be considered secular. So, in effect, non-sacred, non-religious, very plain and dry type stories. Then we get fairy tales. Fairy tales tend to be, again, secular. They're not religious. But they can happen on a different world and at different times, and are often very much full of fiction. We can then get legends, and these can hover in a time period between history and prehistory. They can contain occasionally a sacred figure, but often do not, and somewhat walk a tightrope between fact and fiction. And when we're studying legends, we're never quite sure what is what. And they always happen on our world. But finally, we have myths, and myths happen on a world that often looks like ours geographically, but there are places and figures there that are mythical, that do not exist. So we consider it a different world. It happens in a time that is before our own, in what we call prehistory, so that no historic texts have been written at the time the myth happens. And it contains sacred figures, so it will contain gods or demigods or a supernatural being. And by supernatural, that's often referred to as by people who believe that supernatural being as a religious figure. And so therefore that story, having these sacred figures in and telling a tale, is often considered a sacred story and has sacred truths. And the thing is that if you are a teller of that tale who does not believe that religion, then that story is a myth. However, if you believe the religion for which the story is, then that story is religious. So myth and religious texts can be considered one and the same thing, but differ depending on who is telling it and to whom. Now we understand what a myth is. How do you find myths if you want to study them? And what we can do is use motifs to understand that. But what is a motif? Why do we have them? Well, we catalogue myths, we categorize them so they're easy to find, because there are thousands, well, in fact, hundreds of thousands of myths. So how do you find the one you want? Well, you look up in a catalogue what it is. Now, there are various types of catalogues to categorize stories. The most famous one probably being the Arne Thompson or the Arne Thompson-Uther Index, which is normally associated with folk tales or fairy tales, folklore, and fiction, so the non-sacred stuff, but there is sacred stories in there. But myths have been best catalogued, in my opinion, by Yuri Bereskin in his catalogue, which has then been put into the Mythology database and translated and expanded. And what Yuri Bereskin has done here is he's tried to create a global overarching theme for stories and place them in that. So there is a high-level catalogue of around, I think it's 12 or 13 subjects, and then in each of those there's probably maybe up to 300 subcategories, and those categories don't include sort of details. They are just sort of the core plot point of the story, written in a way that can be applied to a story irrespective of the culture it's come from or the language being spoken by that culture, and that's really important. So once you understand the type of story you want, maybe a creation myth, and you go into creation myths and there'll be different types of myths, how do you then pull out the stories you want and compare them? How do you know the difference between those stories? And that is where mythemes come in. So mythemes are individual points within a story that, again, sort of transcend cultural and linguistic boundaries. So if you take a translated Russian story from the Orthodox Church and a story from the Zulus in southern Africa, You should be able to compare their mythemes because they should be described in such a way that language and culture would not affect that description. And whilst there are around 3,000 plus categories in the Bearskin catalogue, amongst maybe 250,000 myths, mytheme-wise, there are probably nearer 500,000 mythemes across those stories. So they're far more detailed. There is quite a bit of overlap. I'd say there's probably about a 20 to 30% overlap of mythemes across many stories. But by taking a myth, so if you know what the myth is, you can find the myth within the category and you can understand the mythemes within it if you detail those, and then you find another myth the same way, you compare them, you can compare those mythemes to see if the story is the same, and if they're not, you can then use statistical analysis to understand if one evolved from the other or whether they are different. And that statistical analysis, phylogenetics, there are multiple ways of doing that. Far too detailed for this short video, but that is where you go if you want to really understand the details. So I hope that explains at a high level the difference between myths, motifs, and mythemes. Thank you.